11 years ago, my father looked me in the eyes and told me that if I married the man I loved, I would no longer be part of his family. I thought losing my family would be the hardest thing I would ever experience. I was wrong. The hardest part wasn't being disowned. It was spending the next 11 years watching them celebrate birthdays, holidays, weddings, and milestones as if I had never existed. No phone calls, no Christmas cards, no invitations, nothing. Then one afternoon, after more than a decade of complete silence, my father appeared on my front porch carrying a leather briefcase. For a moment, I thought he had come to apologize. I thought maybe age had softened him. Maybe regret had finally caught up with him. Maybe he wanted to meet the granddaughter he had ignored for 11 years. But I couldn't have been more wrong, because my father didn't come back for forgiveness. He came back for money. Nearly $1 million. And he had brought paperwork explaining why he believed I owed it to him. What he didn't know was that I had spent 11 years keeping every receipt, every returned letter, every ignored invitation, every unanswered message, every piece of evidence proving exactly who abandoned whom. And before he walked away that day, I was going to make him read every single page. My name is Nora Bennett, and I am 35 years old. 3 weeks ago, my father knocked on my front door for the first time in 11 years. He stood there holding a worn leather briefcase and a neatly folded document. The document wasn't an apology. It wasn't a letter explaining why he disappeared from my life. It wasn't even an attempt to reconnect with his grandchildren, whom he had never met. It was an invoice. According to the paperwork in his hand, I owed him $980,000. He didn't ask how I had been. He didn't ask about my husband. He didn't ask about my children. The first thing he said after 11 years of silence was, "We need to settle what you owe this family." I remember staring at him and thinking how strange it was that time had changed almost everything except him. His hair had turned gray. The lines around his eyes had deepened. His shoulders seemed smaller than I remembered. Yet somehow he still carried himself with the same certainty, the same belief that he could walk into a room and decide what everyone else owed. What my father didn't know was that I had spent the last 11 years keeping records. Not because I expected him to come back. Not because I was planning revenge. I kept records because I needed proof that what happened had actually happened. Every unanswered letter, every returned birthday card, every ignored invitation, every message that never received a reply, every moment my family chose silence, and I had saved it all. Long before my father arrived with his invoice, I had created one of my own. Mine wasn't measured in dollars. Mine was measured in years. Before I tell you what happened on my front porch that afternoon, I need to take you back to the beginning. I need to tell you about the town where I grew up, the family I thought would always stand beside me, and the decision that cost me everything. I grew up in a small town called Ashford Ridge. It was one of those places where everybody knew everybody else's business before breakfast. There was a single grocery store, a single church, and a diner where the same group of retirees occupied the same corner booth every morning. People didn't just know your name there. They knew your parents, your grandparents, and the mistakes you made in middle school. My father, Richard Bennett, was one of the most respected men in town. He owned a construction company that had built half the buildings people used every day. If a new business opened, there was a good chance my father had helped build it. He served on community boards, sponsored little league teams, and shook hands with everyone he met. To outsiders, he looked like the kind of man every family wanted. At home, things were different. My father believed life was simple. You followed the rules, you respected tradition, you stayed loyal to family. And most importantly, you never embarrassed the Bennett name. Those expectations hung over our house like invisible laws. Nobody talked about them because nobody needed to. We all knew them. My mother, Elaine, rarely challenged him. She wasn't cruel and she wasn't cold. She simply spent most of her life trying to keep the peace. If my father said something unfair, she would change the subject. If he hurt someone's feelings, she would quietly smooth things over afterward. Looking back, I think she convinced herself that avoiding conflict was the same thing as solving it. Then there was my younger brother, Ethan. Ethan could do no wrong. He wasn't a bad person. In fact, he was funny, outgoing, and impossible not to like. Teachers loved him. Neighbors loved him. My father adored him. Wherever Ethan went, attention seemed to follow. I spent years feeling like a supporting character in a story where he was the star. I learned early that praise worked differently for me. Ethan got praised for potential. I got praised for result. If Ethan earned a B, everyone celebrated how hard he tried. If I earned an A, people nodded and said, "That's expected." At first, I didn't mind. I buried myself in books and schoolwork. Numbers made sense to me in a way people often did. Math had rules. Accounting had rules. Spreadsheets had rules. Effort produced results. The world felt predictable when everything was written down. By the time I graduated high school, I had earned a scholarship to a university nearly 800 miles away. It was the first time I had ever seriously considered leaving home. I remember bringing the acceptance letter to the dinner table. My hands were shaking because I thought everyone would be excited. My mother smiled. Ethan congratulated. My father folded the letter, set it down, and asked one question. "Why would you go that far away?" I thought he was joking. He wasn't. For him, leaving felt like rejection. He had spent his entire life in Ashford Ridge. He couldn't understand why anyone would willingly choose a different future. That conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, but it revealed something I would spend years trying to ignore. My father loved me as long as my choices fit inside the future he had already imagined for me. The first crack in our relationship appeared that night. The second appeared 3 years later when I met Daniel Harper. At the time, I thought Daniel was the most patient man I had ever met. He was studying software engineering while working nights to pay tuition. He never seemed rushed, never seemed angry. He listened carefully when people spoke, as if their words actually mattered. We met during a group project that neither of us wanted to be part of. The project lasted 6 weeks. The friendship lasted much longer. Daniel came from a very different background than mine. His mother had raised him alone. Money had always been tight. Nothing had been handed to him. Yet he carried himself with a quiet confidence that came from solving his own problems instead of waiting for someone else to solve. By graduation, I knew I loved him. By the following spring, I knew my family wouldn't. I wish I could say there was one dramatic moment where everything fell apart. The truth is uglier than that. Relationships rarely explode all at once. They crack slowly until one day they finally collapse under the weight of everything left unsaid. When I told my parents I planned to marry Daniel, the silence on the other end of the phone lasted so long that I thought the call had dropped. It hadn't. My father was still there, listening, judging, and deciding. I didn't know it then, but that conversation would change the course of the next 11 years of my life. The first warning came from my mother 2 days after that phone call. She didn't call to congratulate. She didn't ask about the proposal or whether we had set a date. Instead, she called while I was leaving work and spoke in the careful, nervous voice she always used when she was carrying one of my father's opinions. "Your dad is having a hard time with this," she said. I remember stopping beside my car in the parking garage and staring at the concrete wall across from me. "A hard time with what?" I asked. The silence that followed told me everything. Not the engagement, not marriage, Daniel. My mother sighed heavily. "You know your father had different plans." Different plans. I hated that phrase. As if my life had been a project someone else was managing. As if I had somehow violated a contract nobody had shown me. For the next several weeks, every conversation felt like walking through a minefield. My father rarely spoke directly about his objections. Instead, he talked around them. He asked whether Daniel could provide financial stability. He questioned whether we were rushing things. He wondered whether our goals aligned. On the surface, the concerns sounded reasonable, but they weren't, because every answer I gave only led to another objection. Every explanation simply revealed a new reason why Daniel wasn't good enough. Eventually, I realized the truth. The problem wasn't Daniel. The problem was that I had chosen him. My father wasn't losing a future son-in-law. He was losing control. The final confrontation happened 3 months before the wedding. I drove home for a weekend visit, hoping face-to-face conversations would succeed where phone calls had failed. Instead, it became one of the worst nights of my life. Dinner started quietly enough. My mother served roast chicken. Ethan talked about work. My father barely looked at me. The tension sat at the table like an extra guest. Finally, halfway through the meal, my father set down his fork. "You still planning to go through with it?" he asked. I knew exactly what he meant. "Yes," The word seemed to harden something in his face. You really think this is the right decision? I do. He leaned back in his. You've changed. The accusation caught me off guard. I grew up. No, he said. You stopped listening. Nobody spoke. The room suddenly felt smaller. My mother stared at her plate. Ethan stared at the wall, and my father stared at me. For the first time, I understood that nobody was going to help me. Nobody was going to step in. Nobody was going to say this conversation had gone too far. I was on my own. What exactly do you want me to do? I asked quietly. His answer came immediately. Cancel the wedding. The words hung in the air. I honestly thought I had misheard him. What? You heard me. I laughed once. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. You expect me to cancel my wedding? I expect you to make a smart decision. I'm marrying the man I love, and I'm telling you it's a mistake. The argument that followed lasted nearly an hour. Every year since then, pieces of it have faded, but some sentences remain crystal clear. I remember my father standing. I remember him pointing toward the front door, and I remember him saying words I would never forget. If you walk down that aisle, don't bother coming back here. The room went silent. Even my mother looked shocked. For a moment I thought he might take it back. He didn't. Instead, he repeated it. Slower this time. If you marry him, you're choosing a different family. I looked at my mother. She said nothing. I looked at Ethan. He lowered his eyes, and in that moment something inside me broke. Not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly. The way a rope finally snaps after being pulled too tight for too long. I stood up, walked to the guest room, packed my overnight bag, and left. Nobody followed me. Nobody stopped me. Nobody called me back. The entire drive home, I kept checking my phone. Part of me expected a message. An apology, a correction, anything. Nothing came. 3 weeks later, Daniel and I got married. It wasn't a grand wedding. There were no chandeliers. No expensive venue. No giant guest list. We rented a small garden overlooking the river and invited the people who genuinely wanted to be there. About 30 guests attended. Every single seat was filled, except for 4. The 4 seats reserved for my parents and brother remained empty throughout the ceremony. I tried not to look at them, but I did, over and over again. Daniel noticed. When the ceremony ended, he squeezed my hand and whispered, "Look at me." I did. "Those empty chairs aren't your family," he said softly. "The people who showed up are." For a second I couldn't speak, because he was right. His mother had traveled across the country to attend. His friends helped set up decorations. His aunt baked our wedding cake. His cousins danced until midnight. People who owed us nothing had shown us more love than my own family. Still, that night hurt. Not because I doubted my decision, because I knew exactly what it had cost. A week after the wedding, I mailed photographs to my parents. I included a short handwritten note. I kept it simple. I told them I loved them. I told them I hoped we could fix things someday. And I included 3 photographs. One of the ceremony, one of Daniel and me, and one family picture featuring everyone who attended. The envelope returned 10 days later, unopened. A bright yellow sticker covered the front, returned to sender. I stared at it for nearly 5 minutes. Then I carried it into my apartment, opened my desk drawer, and created the first file. At the time, it wasn't a binder. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't preparation. It was simply a folder. A place to store something I couldn't bring myself to throw away. I wrote one sentence on the front. Wedding photos returned unopened. Date recorded. That was item 1. I had no idea I was beginning a collection that would eventually span 11 years. I had no idea that one day those records would become more valuable than any legal document in my house. And I definitely had no idea that the same father who refused to open a wedding photograph would someday stand on my porch demanding nearly $1 million. But life has a strange sense of time. Sometimes the people who reject you, when you have nothing, become very interested once you've built something worth taking. First year after the wedding was the hardest. Not because Daniel and I struggled with our marriage, but because I was grieving people who were still alive. That's a strange kind of loss. When someone dies, the world understands your pain. People send flowers. They offer condolences. They acknowledge that something important has been taken from you. But when your family simply decides you no longer exist, there is no ceremony for that. No sympathy cards, no official ending. Just silence. For months, I kept expecting my phone to ring. Every time an unknown number appeared on the screen, a small part of me wondered if it was my mother. Every holiday felt like standing outside a brightly lit house, looking through the window at a celebration you were no longer invited to attend. Thanksgiving came and went. Christmas passed. Then New Year's. Not a single message arrived. I tried anyway. I sent my parents a Christmas card with a picture from our honeymoon. No response. I mailed birthday cards to both of them. No response. I left a voicemail on my mother's birthday telling her I loved her. No response. The silence became so consistent that eventually it developed its own rhythm. Every attempt I made disappeared into the same empty space. Daniel never told me to stop trying. That was one of the things I loved most about him. He never pressured me to choose between hope and acceptance. Instead, he let me arrive at my own conclusions. One evening, almost a year after our wedding, I came home from work and found him sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by notebooks, diagrams, and pages covered with handwritten calculations. "What is all this?" I asked. He smiled. "A terrible idea," I laughed. "That sounds promising." Daniel had spent years working for a software company that specialized in business management systems. The work paid well, but he hated most of it. Every week he watched small business owners struggle with complicated regulations, reporting requirements, and compliance procedures they barely understood. Large corporations could afford expensive consultants and legal teams. Small businesses couldn't. The result was a system where ordinary business owners spent more time dealing with paperwork than running their company. Daniel thought technology could fix that. His idea was simple: create software that automated the most frustrating parts of regulatory compliance. Not glamorous, not exciting, not the kind of idea that attracted headlines, but it solved a real problem. And sometimes those are the best businesses. For the next year, our apartment became a second office. Daniel worked during the day and built software at night. I handled financial projections, market research, and budgeting. Most evenings ended with both of us sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by spreadsheets and coffee mugs. We weren't chasing wealth. We were chasing freedom. The freedom to build something ourselves. The freedom to create a future nobody could take away. The freedom to stop needing approval from people who had already decided we didn't deserve it. By the second year, the company officially launched. Our first month brought exactly 3 paying customers. 3. I still remember the excitement. Most people would have seen failure. We saw proof. 3 complete strangers had chosen to trust something we created. That mattered. The company grew slowly, painfully slowly. Some months we wondered if we were wasting our time. Other months gave us just enough progress to keep going. Through all of it, my family remained silent. The folder in my desk slowly grew thicker. Another returned Christmas card. Another unanswered letter. Another invitation ignored. Every item received a date. Every item received a label. Not because I planned to use it. Not because I expected anyone else to care. Because recording facts helped me stay honest. Memory changes over time. Documents don't. By year 3, something unexpected happened. I stopped checking my phone. I stopped waiting. I stopped imagining surprise reunions. For the first time, I allowed myself to accept reality. My family wasn't taking time to heal. They had made a choice. And their choice was me. Oddly enough, accepting that truth hurt less than fighting it. The energy I had spent hoping finally became available for living. Daniel and I poured it into our business, into our marriage, into building a life that felt whole even without the people. Then, in the spring of our 4th year, everything changed. I found out I was pregnant. The test sat on the bathroom counter while I stared at it in complete disbelief. Then I checked it again, and again, and again. Daniel thought something terrible had happened because I was crying when I walked into the living room. "What is it?" he asked. I handed him the test. For several seconds he simply stared. Then he looked at me, then back at the test, then back at me. And suddenly he was laughing and crying at the same time. Neither of us slept much that night. We spent hours talking about names, schools, bedrooms, and possibilities. The future suddenly felt larger than it had the day before. 8 months later, our daughter was born. We named her Olivia. The moment I held her for the first time, I understood something that had never fully made sense before. Love wasn't something you earned. It wasn't something you qualified for. It wasn't something that depended on obedience. I loved that tiny little girl before she had accomplished a single thing, before she had spoken a word, before she had succeeded or failed at anything. She existed. That was enough. And for the first time in my life, I realized how abnormal my father's version of love had been. Because real love doesn't keep score. Real love doesn't demand loyalty contracts. Real love doesn't disappear when someone makes a choice you dislike. A week after Olivia was born, I mailed an announcement to my parents. Part of me already knew what would happen. Still, I tried. I included photographs, a handwritten note, and a simple message telling them they had become grandparents. The envelope returned 12 days later, unopened. I stared at it while Olivia slept beside me. Then I added another item to the file. Granddaughter announcement returned unopened. Date recorded. Item number 12. That night I didn't cry. I simply felt tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying disappointment for too long. Daniel found me sitting at the dining room table after midnight. The returned envelope lay beside me. He read the label, then sat down without saying anything. For a while we simply listened to the sounds of our daughter sleeping in the next room. Finally he spoke. "You know what she's going to remember." I looked at him. "What?" "Not who wasn't there." He nodded toward Olivia's bedroom. "She's going to remember who was." Those words stayed with me because he was right. Children build their memories from presence, not absence. The next few years moved faster than I thought possible. The company grew from 3 employees to 12. Then 12 became 21. Our software expanded into multiple industries. Revenue increased. Customers recommended us to other customers. The business wasn't exploding overnight. It was doing something better. It was lasting. At home, Olivia grew into a bright, curious little girl who asked endless questions and somehow managed to leave crayons in every room of the house. Life became busy in the best possible way, and gradually something surprising happened. The file stopped feeling painful. It became administrative. A record, nothing more. I rarely opened it. Months passed without adding anything. Then one afternoon, an old friend from Ashford Ridge sent me a message. The subject line contained only 4 words. "Thought you should know." Attached was a screenshot. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I saw my father's face, and my stomach tightened. The article was about his construction company, the business that had supported our family for decades, the business he had built his identity around, the business that had always seemed untouchable. According to the article, it was facing serious financial trouble. Contracts had been lost. Loans were under pressure. Several major projects had collapsed. No detail. Just enough information to suggest something was very wrong. I stared at the screen for a long time. Not because I felt happy. I didn't. But because for the first time in years, I sensed movement. A crack in the perfect image my father had spent decades protecting. At the time, I had no idea how important that article would become. I had no idea it was the first domino. And I certainly had no idea that within a few years, the same man who refused to acknowledge his granddaughter would be standing on my doorstep asking for nearly $1 million. But the story was already moving in that direction. I just couldn't see it yet. The article about my father's company should not have mattered to me. At least that's what I told myself. For years, I had worked hard to build a life that didn't revolve around the people who had abandoned me. I had a husband who loved me, a daughter who filled our home with laughter, and a business that was finally becoming something real. Whether my father's company succeeded or failed should have been irrelevant. Yet after reading that article, I found myself thinking about him more than I had in years. Not because I missed him, because I was curious. My father had always seemed untouchable. Growing up, he was the strongest person in every room, the loudest voice, the final decision maker, the man who always knew what everyone else should do. The idea that he could be struggling felt impossible, and somehow that impossibility made it difficult to ignore. Over the following months, bits of information started reaching me through old friends and former neighbors from Ashford Ridge. Nobody called directly to gossip. Most people were careful. But small-town news has a way of traveling. A canceled project here, a lawsuit there, employees being laid off, equipment being sold, nothing dramatic by itself. Together, however, the pieces formed a picture. Something was wrong, very wrong. Meanwhile, life in our corner of the world was moving in the opposite direction. The software company Daniel and I had built from our apartment kitchen continued growing faster than either of us expected. For years, success had arrived in tiny increments. A new client, a new employee, a slightly larger office. Now those increments were becoming larger. A regional bank signed a multi-year contract, then a national chain, then another. For the first time, investors started calling us instead of the other way around. One afternoon, Daniel walked into my office carrying a stack of reports and wearing the expression he always had when he was trying not to get excited too early. "We need to talk," he said. That sentence usually meant one of two things. Either something was wrong or something was very right. This time it was the second. We spent 3 hours reviewing financial projections. When we finally finished, neither of us spoke for a while. The numbers were difficult to believe. After years of uncertainty, the company was becoming genuinely valuable. Not successful by our standards, successful by everyone's standard. The kind of success people notice. The kind that attracts attention. The kind that eventually finds its way back to the hometown you left behind. That realization bothered me more than I expected. Because attention has a way of waking up people who previously ignored you. A few months later, I learned I was right. The first message arrived through social media. It came from someone I hadn't spoken to since high school. The message was cheerful, friendly, casual. It asked how life was going. At first I thought nothing of it. Then another message arrived. Then another. Then another. People who hadn't spoken to me in a decade suddenly seemed interested in reconnecting. The pattern became obvious. Someone had noticed our success, and news was spreading. I ignored most of it, not out of bitterness, out of practicality. You learn a lot about relationships when you spend years being forgotten. One of those lessons is that genuine interest usually arrives before success, not afterward. The strangest moment came 6 months later. I was helping Olivia build a blanket fort in our living room when my phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar. I almost ignored it. Something made me answer. "Hello." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then I heard a voice I hadn't heard in nearly 8 years. "Nora." I froze, every muscle in my body tight. I would have recognized that voice anywhere. My mother. For several seconds, neither of us said anything. The silence felt heavier than conversation. Finally, she spoke again. "You sound good." That was her opening line. Not "I'm sorry." Not "I've missed you." Not "How have you been?" "You sound good." I looked at Olivia sitting on the floor surrounded by blankets and pillows. She was humming to herself, completely unaware that history had just walked back into my life. "I'm doing fine," I said. Another pause. Then she asked, "How's your family?" "Your family, not our family, not my granddaughter, your family." The distinction didn't escape. I answered politely, kept everything neutral. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. When it ended, I sat quietly for a long time. Daniel found me still staring at the phone 20 minutes later. "What happened?" he asked. "My mother called." His eyebrows rose. "After all this time?" I nodded. "What did she want?" That was the question. What did she want? Because despite everything, I knew one thing. People rarely reappear after years of silence without a reason. At the time, however, I couldn't identify the reason. The answer came 3 weeks later. Another phone call. This time from Ethan, my brother. The same brother who had watched me leave that night years ago without saying a word. The same brother who had never once reached out after. His tone was awkward, forced, like someone reading from a script. We talked for 15 minutes. Most of the conversation consisted of small talk, work, life, weather. Then near the end, he finally asked the question he actually called to ask. "How's the company doing?" There it was, the real reason. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was predictable. The conversation ended shortly afterward. When I told Daniel about it, he gave me a look. "What? You know exactly what's happening." I did. I just didn't want to admit it. For years, my family showed no interest in my life. Now suddenly they wanted updates. Detail. Information, not about me, about the company, about money, about success. The pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. Still, I wasn't prepared for what happened next. A year later, our company completed a major acquisition deal. The transaction didn't make national news, but it received enough industry attention to become public knowledge. Overnight, estimates of our company's value increased dramatically. People who had never heard of us suddenly knew our name, and apparently, so did my father. 2 months after the acquisition, an envelope arrived. No return address. No note, just documents. Lots of documents. I opened them at the kitchen table while Daniel prepared dinner. Within minutes, I realized they all related to my father's business. Financial records, loan notices, property assessments, debt statements, pages and pages of numbers. At first I thought someone had mailed them by mistake. Then I noticed a handwritten note attached to the final page. The handwriting belonged to my mother. 3 short sentences. Your father won't listen to me. Things are worse than you think. Please don't tell him I sent this. I read the note twice, then 3 times. Then I handed everything to Daniel. He spent nearly an hour reviewing the document. When he finally looked up, his expression was grim. How bad? I asked. He leaned back in his chair. Very. The room suddenly felt smaller. Daniel pointed toward one page, then another. Then another. Outstanding debt, overdue obligations, collateral agreements, refinanced loans. The deeper we looked, the clearer the picture became. My father's company wasn't struggling, it was collapsing. Years of bad decisions had finally caught up with him, and according to these documents, there wasn't much time left. For a moment, I felt something unexpected. Sadness. Not for the company, for the man. Because despite everything he had done, despite all the years of silence, part of me still remembered the father who taught me to ride a bicycle. The father who once carried me on his shoulders. The father I spent years wishing would come back. Daniel reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You okay? I nodded, but I wasn't sure whether it was true. The next few weeks passed quietly. No calls, no messages, no surprises. Then one Saturday afternoon, everything changed. Olivia was at a friend's birthday party. Daniel was running errands. I was home alone, sorting paperwork in my office. The doorbell rang. I almost ignored it. I wasn't expecting anyone. But something made me get up. Something made me walk to the front door. Something made my stomach tighten before I even looked through the window. When I opened the door, a man stood on my porch holding a leather briefcase. For a second, I didn't recognize him. Then I did. 11 years had passed. 11 years of silence. 11 years of absence. 11 years without apologies. Without explanations. Without accountability. And there he was, Richard Bennett, my father, standing on my porch like he belonged there. His hair was gray. His face looked older. His shoulders seemed heavier. But his eyes were exactly the same. He lifted the briefcase slightly. Then he said the first words he had spoken to me in more than a decade. We need to discuss what you owe this family. I stared at him, certain I had heard wrong, but I hadn't, because my father had not come to apologize. He had not come to reconnect. He had not come to meet his granddaughter. He had come with a demand. And inside that briefcase was an invoice that claimed I owed him nearly $1 million. What he didn't know was that I had spent 11 years keeping records. And before this conversation ended, every single one of them was about to matter. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I simply stood there staring at the man who had erased me from his life 11 years earlier. The same man who ignored my wedding, rejected every attempt I made to reconnect, and never once asked about the granddaughter he had never met. Yet somehow he stood on my porch acting as though we were in the middle of an ordinary business discussion. We need to discuss what you owe this family. The sentence echoed in my mind, not because it was confusing, because it was absurd. I looked past him. The street was quiet. A neighbor was walking a dog 2 houses down. The world continued as if nothing unusual was happening. Meanwhile, my father had just appeared after more than a decade of silence and informed me that I owed him something. What exactly do you think I owe? I asked. He adjusted his grip on the briefcase. May I come inside? No, the answer came immediately. For the first time, he seemed slightly surprised, not offended. Surprised, as though it had never occurred to him that access to my home was something he needed to earn. His expression tightened. This conversation would be easier in private. We can have it right here. A long silence followed. Then he opened the briefcase. Inside was a thick stack of documents. He removed the top page and handed it to me. Reluctantly, I took it. The heading alone nearly made me laugh. Family Investment Reimbursement Summary. I read the first paragraph, then the second. Then the itemized list beneath it. College support. housing assistance during child, medical expenses, food, clothing, transportation. Every dollar my parents had spent raising me had apparently been transformed into a debt. The total sat at the bottom of the page. $982,417. I looked up slowly. You cannot be serious. His face remained completely neutral. I've discussed this with advisors. Advisors? Financial advisors. I stared at him. The situation had crossed so far beyond normal that I wasn't sure how to respond. You think I owe you money for raising me? His jaw tightened. I think parents make sacrifices. They do. I think children should recognize those sacrifices. They should. And I think successful children should support their family. There it was. The real argument, not reimbursement, not fairness. Access. He wanted access to money, my money, the money Daniel and I had spent over a decade. I handed the document back. No, the answer was simple, immediate, final. His eyes narrowed slightly. You didn't even consider it. I considered it for exactly 3 seconds. His voice hardened. Without me, you wouldn't have had opportunities. I laughed, not because anything was funny, because I suddenly understood something important. For 11 years, I had imagined this moment, not this exact conversation, but a reunion, a confront, an explanation. Some part of me had always wondered what I would feel if I saw him again. Anger, sadness, relief. Instead, what I felt was clarity, crystal clear clarity. Because standing there, listening to him explain why I owed him nearly $1 million, I realized he wasn't here to repair anything. He wasn't here because he loved me. He wasn't here because he regretted losing 11 years. He was here because his options had run out, and I happened to have resources. Nothing more, nothing less. You abandoned me. The words came out quietly. His face didn't change. We had disagreements. No, I shook my head. We had disagreements, you made a choice. He looked away briefly, then back at me. You married against my wishes. And you knew how I felt. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Even now, even after everything, he was still defending it, still justifying it, still convinced he had been right. You missed my wedding. You chose that. I actually blinked. What? You created the situation. The statement was so astonishing that for a moment I couldn't speak. Then something unexpected happened. I stopped arguing, completely. Because suddenly I understood there was no point. You cannot reason someone out of a belief they've protected for over a decade. My father wasn't here to understand. He was here to collect. And since collection had failed, the conversation was effectively over. Wait here, he frowned. What? Wait here. I stepped inside and closed the door, not because I needed time to think, because I knew exactly where I was going, my office. The bottom drawer, the gray filing cabinet beside the bookshelf. Inside sat a thick black binder, much larger than the original folder. 11 years of records, 11 years of date, 11 years of evidence. I hadn't opened it in months. Dust covered the top. I carried it back to the front door. My father was still standing exactly where I left him, confused now, uncertain. I walked onto the porch and placed the binder in his hands. He looked down at it. What is this? The answer to your invoice. For the first time since arriving, he seemed genuinely puzzled. I opened the binder. The first page contained a photograph, my wedding invitation. Below it sat a certified mail receipt, and below that sat proof that the invitation had been delivered. I flipped the page. Wedding photographs returned unopened, date included, envelope attached. I flipped again. Birthday card, returned unopened. Christmas card, returned unopened. Voicemail records, letters, delivery confirmations. Every attempt I had made to maintain a relationship, every rejection, every silence, every absence, page after page, year after year, his expression slowly changed. I continued turning pages. Olivia's birth announcement, returned unopened. Birthday invitations, ignored. Holiday photographs, returned. Letters, ignored. Messages, ignored. There were dozens of entries, each one documented, each one dated, each one impossible to dispute. What is this supposed to prove? He asked. I looked directly at him. It proves I tried. The words hung between us. For the first time since arriving, he had no immediate response, so I continued. It proves I called. Another page. It proves I wrote. Another page. It proves I invited. Another page. It proves I gave you every opportunity. His face darkened. This is ridiculous. No, I pointed at the binder. This is documentation. The accountant in me suddenly took over. Calm, precise, unemotional. The wedding invitation was delivered. Page. The photographs were returned. Page. The birth announcement was returned. Page. The birthday invitations received no response. Page. 11 years of records. Page. Not opinions. Page. Facts. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he closed the binder. Hard. I don't see what this has to do with anything. That sentence told me everything. Because he genuinely didn't. He truly couldn't understand. To him, relationships and money existed in separate categories. To me, they were connected. Not because love should be transactional, because trust matters, and trust is earned through action. You want almost $1 million. I nodded toward the binder. That's what it has to do with. He folded his arms. I raised you, and then you erased me. I did what I thought was right, and now I'm doing what I think is right. His jaw tightened. I could see frustration building. For most of my life, that frustration worked. People gave in. People backed down. People apologized. Not anymore. You owe your success to your upbringing. I shook my head. No, the answer came immediately, firmly, confidently. No, I don't. The look on his face suggested nobody had ever spoken to him that way before. I continued. I owe my success to thousands of late nights. I pointed toward the house. To my husband. I pointed toward myself. To years of work. Then toward the binder. And despite what you think, I achieved all of it without you. The silence that followed felt enormous. Finally, he spoke. You've become very cold. I almost smiled, because that accusation sounded familiar. People often call boundaries cold when those boundaries prevent them from getting what they want. I learned from experience. For the first time, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. Real uncertainty. Because the daughter he remembered no longer existed. The young woman who spent years seeking approval was gone. The woman standing in front of him didn't need his permission, didn't need his validation, didn't need his acceptance, and most importantly, didn't need him. I reached for the binder. He let go, slowly. I held it against my chest. You're not getting $1 million. His expression hardened again. I thought family helped family. The irony was breathtaking. 11 years of silence. And now he wanted to discuss family. I looked him directly in the eyes. Family answers wedding invitations. The words landed. I saw it happen. For the first time all afternoon, he looked away. Family meets their grandchildren. Another silence. Family doesn't disappear for 11 years and come back with an invoice. Neither of us moved. The afternoon sun had started lowering behind the houses across the street. Somewhere nearby, children were playing. Life continued. Ordinary. Unaware. My father cleared his throat, then picked up his briefcase. For a moment I thought he might finally apologize. Not because I expected it. Because after everything else, it seemed like the only thing left to say. Instead, he simply nodded. A small, stiff nod. Then turned and walked toward his car. No apology, no accountability, no explanation, just departure. The same way he had left 11 years earlier. He found me sitting at the kitchen table with a binder open. What happened? He asked. I looked up. And for the first time since the doorbell rang, I smiled. Nothing, he laughed. That doesn't sound like nothing. I closed the binder carefully. Actually, it felt like something ending, not the relationship. That had ended years ago. The waiting, the hoping, the wondering. Those ended that afternoon. Because after 11 years, my father finally came back. And in the end, he gave me something far more valuable than an apology. He gave me certainty. And certainty, I discovered, is worth far more than $1 million. Handwriting was a short message. No signature, no explanation, just one sentence. I should have been proud of you all along. I stared at those words for a long time. Long enough to feel sadness. Long enough to feel relief. Long enough to understand that some apologies arrive differently than we expect. Would I have preferred those words 11 years earlier? Of course. Would they have changed everything? Probably not. Some damage cannot be undone. Some years cannot be returned. But healing isn't always about restoring the past. Sometimes it's about finally telling the truth about it. I placed the photograph inside the binder, not with the evidence, not with the records, In the very last page, a separate section. Then I closed the binder for what I hoped would be the final time, because the story was never really about money. It wasn't about an invoice. It wasn't about nearly $1 million. It wasn't even about being disowned. The story was about something much simpler. The difference between people who demand loyalty and people who earn it. The difference between control and love. And the difference between family by obligation and family by choice. One lasts only as long as circumstances allow. The other survives almost anything. I know which one I was. And thankfully, after all those years, I finally did.